And so now I have it running. But in any case, you can see that after the Iranian Revolution, clerics outlawed all. Now it's weird. I don't think it's just pre-revolutionary music. I think they outlawed all music. You can see why. Hardline clerics say music comes between the faithful and God and leads to an impure mind. So, strictly speaking, music is outlawed by the religious government of Iran, which we call a theocracy, right? We have a democracy, the deme, the people, theoretically, have the power. In Iran, it's a theocracy. God has the power through the imams, right? The ayatollahs, etc. By the way, last night on the BBC, my wife was listening to a story about Pakistan, which is also Islamic majority country, right? And apparently the only music allowed in Pakistan is the playing of those oboe-like instruments to snakes. So snake charming. Apparently snake charming is kind of a community resource, and so it's not considered music for people, it's music for snakes to keep them charmed so that snake charmers can tell snakes what to do, I guess. I don't know. Never been in the presence of a snake charmer, but I thought I'd mention that today as well. Sounds bad, doesn't it? I mean, for me, music is, and in fact, I mentioned this to my wife while we were listening to that story last night, and she said she thinks music is a blessing from God. So it's just, wow, where do you go with that? That's obviously a severe critique of religions that believe all kinds of pleasures are evil and sinful. I think someone mentioned, what about the call to prayer that you hear in the mornings, and actually there's 5 different separate calls per day. Is that music? Not as far as I know. It's instead of call, but and by the way, if you're in a monastery where a convent where people are dedicated to living kind of like the Rule of Augustine, which is dedicated to the same kind of strict thing, they actually, of course, have music where, remember, Augustine thought of music in the same way, or similarly to Plotinus, in that music is a way to connect directly to God. So music is encouraged, although certainly a certain type of music is part of that. And it's also interesting to me that when the Reformation began, with Martin Luther and John Calvin and John Knox and others, that they banned icons. So basically, one of the things that happened was they got rid of all of the art in the churches, the paintings and everything. They whitewashed those churches. So typically, if you go into a Lutheran church, for example, you'll see it's all just whitewashed inside. Often a Protestant icon, if anything, are praying hands. So you're not actually looking at an individual. And a special example of that is on the altars of a Protestant church. You typically see a cross, which is different than a crucifix, because a crucifix actually has the body of Jesus, nails, crown of thorns, etc. Right? So the crucifix has an image of theoretically God, right? And notice that in Islam, it wasn't right away And in fact, one of my colleagues in her, well, she's retired now, but she used to teach our Western religion and Eastern religion courses. And in her Western religion course, one of the things she showed in her class was in fact, on the horse is usually the one that's especially so for example, in earlier times there were Islamic images even of Muhammad, although in this particular one you don't see a face. You see one here. This is him on his flying horse. I don't know how that image comes that way with the peacock tail. I'm not sure. But what she pointed out was that the icon, there's a word for it when you're against icons. I can't think of it offhand. What's it mean? What's the word for? Let me check here. Iconoclast. Thank you. Yeah, iconoclasts believe that icons should be avoided or destroyed if they're there. So in any case, that happened later. And in any case, once it did, Islam, the art associated with Islam is generally the Quran written on walls and things in the mosques and so on, or geometric patterns. Mathematics. Mathematics is certainly absolutely fascinating and interesting. And if you go into the mosque in Mecca, there are pictures all over the place of the creation, and each one is with a different name of God, so that remember there's I don't know an infinite number of names of God. The same issue associated with the ontological argument that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. If that's the case, then God has, as Spinoza argues, an infinity of qualities. We can't even think of all of them. So the idea of the mosque in Mecca. Let me see if I can. Shoot. Sure if I'm in the right place or not, but as you come into the mosque, there's like a route that you could take around the perimeter of the mosque that has wall pictures with all the names of God. It's on perhaps on YouTube as a video, but it's also on Google Earth. So if you go that way, you can see it. In any case, the reason what did I just lose? I deleted something. Not one of the things I plan on using. But so when we're talking about John Locke, we're talking about the social contract philosophers. As I mentioned, we have talked about Hobbes. We certainly talked about Locke, who is the one that's most important for the American project or the American experiment, so to speak. The other one, and I don't think I ever showed you him, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Easy to pull up. By the way, I have to mention a couple of interesting things about Rousseau. why not? His friend, Voltaire, you probably have heard of him. Yes? How many folks have heard of Voltaire? Okay. Rousseau starts off as a composer. So, for example, so he writes an opera. I don't know how many he wrote, but so Rousseau's beginning career, so to speak, is as an opera composer, and he was moderately successful. Not, superbly so, but nonetheless he was okay. I guess people liked his opera. I don't know if there was more than one. This is the only one I've ever noticed. But he was disappointed. He thought he'd become more famous more rapidly. So he wrote to his friend Voltaire and asked Voltaire, how do I become popular? How do I become famous? And Voltaire wrote back to him and said, write books where you say exactly the opposite of what everybody believes, and you become popular. And what's funny is, after that advice, he went and he wrote, find some stuff. Return to Paris, return to Geneva, Voltaire, fugitive. In Britain, he ended up in Britain for a while, had a quarrel with David Hume. I mean, he stayed with David Hume for a while, but they argued over things. There's his crypt in the Pantheon, where Napoleon is in Paris. Let me find his books. One books. Well, these are actually topics on it. One of the books he wrote, for example, is Emile on education, which I understand the Department of Education still uses as a textbook for students who are learning to become teachers of like elementary education or whatever. Well, the main point of Emile is that the best education is no education. Education is a corrupting influence. So as a result, you should just let kids grow up and play. In fact, you should kick them out of the house. And the survivors will come to you and ask questions, and you should answer their questions. So the key phrase is that it should be child-centered education. The child asks the questions and you answer them as they're curious about things. And that's the way he thinks education should go. And now, if you see it from the interesting letters with Voltaire, you realize that he is saying just the opposite of what everybody believes. And sure enough, he became popular with that book, right? So that was a way to become famous, is to say just the opposite of what everybody believes. And what's amazing to me is that if you think of it that way, it's a joke. That's not really a serious explanation of how to educate people. And yet, otherwise brilliant people believe that the book is a good book that should be used as a curriculum for teachers to learn how to teach children. Another, economic theory, the social contract. So in his social contract, we get the idea that man is completely good in nature. So where you have the dog-eat-dog world of Hobbes in the hypothetical state of nature, Locke, it's a family, and as a result, it's a family that loves one another and tries to do their best, but it gets more and more complex, and so you need to develop government. With Rousseau, the state of nature is the ideal situation. and all government is corrupting. So any attempt to impose a set of regulations and things on man in the state of nature, the hypothetical state of nature, is actually a corrupting influence. That we should stay instead closer to the ideal native. And by the way, this was a philosophy that led to a lot of people thinking that native Indians, for example, were wonderful in their, right? You've heard that kind, the native, and the last of the Mohicans, and they're such ideal, wonderful people, and the corrupting influences of governments or Western influences, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, we still have that kind of view in a lot of ways where, people think of indigenous people in different places are essentially living kind of the more idealized life as opposed to, the influence of a Western or technological society. I could see that too, by the way. There are certainly arguments where you might want to say that life is simpler and more communal and so on. But in any case, remember this, at least in the eyes of some of us who interpret what's going on, Rousseau is playing a joke on everyone and became famous for it. And the same thing with his political philosophy. In his political philosophy, his social contract argues that we shouldn't have representatives of us. We shouldn't be like voting for who we want to run, as our local representative or as our mayor. Instead, we should all come together in assemblies and vote on everything, so that everyone has their own vote, and nothing happens in the community unless it's an outstanding majority of people that all like, we want this, right? And as I mentioned, just horribly, the French actually tried that in 1789, and as you know, it devolved into a total disaster. The terror essentially is what was associated with it, as they basically chopped heads off left and right. Even Robespierre, the one who chopped the most heads off, ended up at the end of his career with the same device, the guillotine, chopping his own head off because it's such a chaotic. It didn't work, and so my little spoof on Rousseau. He's interesting because of the havoc his philosophy caused, and I think. And by the way, you could just look up the letters between him and Voltaire. They're on the internet, so you could look those up. And it's funny to me that some people look at those letters and they say they weren't friends. They hated one another. Well, if you read them, at least I think with an ounce of insight into what's going on between them, you realize that they say nasty things to one another in jest. They clearly like writing back and forth to one another, and they clearly talk nastily to one another. But the thing is, it's clear that these are friends to me that are saying these things to one another, because that's the way their humor, sense of humor, worked and how they played with one another. So those are the social contract philosophers of that period. Now you might say, well, wait a minute. Okay, that's fine. Jefferson and Adams and others who were interested, and it was really Locke that did that. By the way, if you would visit Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's mansion in Virginia, and I actually physically was there in Monticello, so it's not a Google Earth thing for me, but actually I'm sure you could see the same thing on Google Earth. In fact, you do, or just look up Wikipedia and look at the pictures that Thomas Jefferson had in his study or actually in the main area as you come into Monticello, and he had 3 paintings on the wall of the men that he thought most highly of. And one was Sir Isaac Newton, the other was John Locke, and the other one was Francis Bacon. So those are the 3 that he sort of idealized and had pictures of. But the social contract philosophy is the political philosophy that inspired our government, and so we continue to have philosophical arguments over the nature of rights. What kind of rights ought we to have, and so on. And so I thought I'd mention the 2 others that are both dead now, but nonetheless were very significant in their day as social contract philosophers. And in fact, I believe if you go to study law, you will have 2 graduate courses based on this guy, John Rawls. And the first one will be based on his theory of justice. And the main point he makes in this is, okay, so we actually have a government now, and so we can't really hypothesize a state of nature. What we can hypothesize, though, or think about, is the actual situation we're in. So that's our original position when we're trying to create law. We have an original position, and this original position is the way our laws are written and how our situation in government is right now. And he argues that in order for us to create good laws based on that original position, what we have to do is use what he calls a veil of ignorance that the legislators have to kind of put over their eyes, so to speak, right? And ignore their actual place in society, so that when they're thinking about what laws ought to be created, they ought not to make laws that are going to be beneficial to them or to individuals in their particular social place. Instead, that veil of ignorance makes them forget who they are and what their society's position is, and instead focus on the real needs of the people of that society and try to pass laws that will be to the benefit of those who have the least in that society. So if you can imagine, John Rawls is clearly considered to be the liberal point of view with regard to this, because his belief is that the theory of justice means that what we need to do is give everybody equal shots at success and opportunities and things of that sort. And how do we change the laws to help those people that are at the bottom so that they'll have better opportunities?